Well, that ends Chapter 1. But before we move on to Chapter 2, let's take a closer look. The story is set almost entirely in the time between Scout Finch's 5th and 9th birthdays. Scout begins the first-person narrative that opens the novel, presumably much later in her life. As a result, the narrative voice fluctuates between the child's point of view, which detail the events as they happen, and the adult voice, which looks back on her childhood many years later. The child's naive voice dominates the central plot and allows us to make connections and understand events in a way that the young Scout does not. At the same time, the narrator often digresses into stories or descriptions presented as she looks back on them, like her depiction of Mockingbird in the first chapter. Mockingbird was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. Somehow, it was hotter then. People moved slowly then. Here, Lee's language indicates an adult's recollection rather than a girl's experience. Boo Radley becomes the focus of the children's curiosity in Chapter 1. We see him portrayed through the perspective of childhood innocence. Thus, he has no identity apart from the youthful superstitions that surround him. Scout describes him as a malevolent phantom over 6 feet tall who eats squirrels and cats. Of course, we realize that there must be more to Boo's story than these superstitions imply. Eventually, Boo will be transformed from a nightmare villain into a human being, and the children's understanding of him will reflect their own journey toward adulthood. Now, let's go ahead and start Chapter 2. The summer's over, and Dill heads back home to Meridian. Scout looks forward to joining the kids at school for the first time, instead of spying on them like some pint-sized stalker. Jim takes her to school and explains that it's different from home, and he doesn't want his first-grade sibling cramping his fifth-grade style. The narrator's teacher is a young woman by the name of Miss Caroline Fisher, who's from North Alabama, otherwise known to the native Macombians as Crazy Land. Miss Caroline puts the alphabet up on the board. All of the class already knows it. Amazing, huh? It's a class full of geniuses. Nope. Most of them are starting first grade for the second time. Miss Caroline asks Scout to read, and she is not happy that Scout's already good at it. You see, she assumes that Atticus has taught Scout how to read. Atticus must stop his reading lessons because he isn't a licensed teacher, and therefore, according to Miss Caroline, he is doing his child more harm than good. Even though Scout's already a fluent reader when the rest of the class is repeating first grade. Scout gets the impression that reading, which seems to come as naturally to her as breathing, is something like a sin when it's done outside of class. Scout zones out till recess. Come on, y'all know what that's like. Then she complains to Jim. Jim says that Miss Caroline is bringing a brand new system of teaching, the Dewey Decimal System. This new system results in more boring class time for Scout. We're going to skip ahead to lunchtime. Miss Caroline is halted in her inspection of her students' lunches by Walter Cunningham, who doesn't have one. She tries to lend him a quarter for lunch, but he refuses to take it. Scout, whose given name we now learn is Jean Louise, steps in, explaining to Miss Caroline that Walter is a Cunningham. Miss Caroline doesn't understand, so Scout explains further. The Cunninghams won't take anything from anybody. They prefer to get by on the little that they have. She further explains that Miss Caroline is making Walter ashamed by trying to lend him money that he can't pay back. Miss Caroline loses it and calls Scout up to the front of the class, where she pats her hand with a ruler and makes her stand in the corner. The class breaks out laughing when they realize that the ruler taps are supposed to be corporal punishment. The bell rings and everyone leaves for lunch. Miss Caroline collapses with her head in her hands at her desk. Now that ends chapter 2, and we're going to end here because chapter 3 continues Scout's day at school. So let's do the analysis of chapters 2 and 3 next time. Well, that's going to wrap it up for Mr. D's keys. I've given the keys to you. Now, go ace that test.